Okay, to start off with a very simple questions. How did you like the movie, and where does it line up in a list of your all-time favorite movies?
I really enjoyed the film. I thought it had a lot to offer. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought, considering it was such a long feature film. And although it's not really like one of my favorite movies, I can see why it's definitely on the list of some of the greatest movies of all time. And I guess it's probably like in my top 20. It was pretty good.
Do you think it's still relevant to modern audiences today, and why?
Oh yeah, I think it's got a lot to offer in terms of analysis, and I'm sure it's a movie that they should definitely show to people that want to be filmmakers so that they kind of understand what it takes to make one of the greatest movies of all time. But I think it just has a lot to offer people in terms of thinking critically about um, symbolism in movies as well as the prison system. I'm sure that's an obvious answer.
Besides what you pointed out, do you believe that's all it has to offer viewers?
Mm, I don't think so. I feel like there's more to it, and just in terms of like the way that they portray Andy Dufresne, because he just seems like a genuinely good person that just wants to, do his own thing and not really get involved in anyone's business. He doesn't show up and immediately start picking fights with people. So I kind of enjoy that. He just wants to do his own thing.
Speaking of Andy Dufresne spends 20 years in Shawshank throughout the film, yet it doesn't feel like so. It goes by in, well, about 2.5 hours worth, and it just goes out in a snap. What do you think the film is trying to say about the temporal rapidity of his sentence?
Well, he spends all of those years in the same place, and prison is generally portrayed as a place where you follow a very strict routine. So I think what the film is trying to portray in that sense of speeding up the passage of time is the fact that spending such a long time in a prison would probably start to blend after a certain point. And I think Red points that out to one of his friends at some point during the film, where he kind of says that you're really uncomfortable in Shawshank at first, and then after a while, you start getting used to everything to the point where it just becomes your whole world, and you don't know how to behave when you leave because it becomes all that you know. So the years just kind of start blurring and blending together.
At some point, Andy Dufresne has enough of that and he just decides to leave Shawshank, especially after he knows that he's innocent. And whilst he goes through that sort of journey, it opens up one of the most one of the key images of the movie, especially like on the cover, and it's his jailbreak. And so, despite the sort of building up to the fantastical nature of a cinematic jailbreak, do you think that this movie was made to instill a sense of fear into audiences about prison? Because similarly, in some ways, the movie glorifies prison life through its depiction of prisoner camaraderie, or in that they start getting so used to prison that they find ways to get outside sources to give them cigarettes and sort of every other day stuff that Red is capable of getting.
I think what the film does really well is instill fear in the prison system or the judicial system, because the entire reason that Andy Dufresne is there is because he was falsely accused. So I think it does a better job of instilling that fear of being sent to prison on a wrong accusation or on false pretenses. And throughout the film, they do repeat the line that everybody here is innocent. Nobody there thinks that they're guilty of whatever crime they're in for, even if they did do it. So I think what's more scary is the idea of being trapped there for 20 years or even longer, because I think there was a guy that was in there for maybe 40 or over 40 years. And just being trapped there under false pretenses, I think that's a lot scarier than just prison itself and not being able to prove them wrong, which Andy tries to do repeatedly. And even when he has that glimmer of hope that he might be able to get out, it doesn't like pan out. So I think that's a lot scarier, is being trapped there with no way to get out.
I think there's a lot of aspects of prison life that in our media we have come to stereotype. For instance, during Andy's first 2 years of being at Shawshank, he is repeatedly raped by prisoners known as the ladies, who Red and the others recognize that they are not, in fact, homosexual. They are just in prison. That is just their livelihood. Do you believe that, in some sense, in comparison to other films that have depicted prison or even media, do you think that it flips the sexuality normatives in any sense of the way?
Mm, I think more so in terms of Andy's interests, where as I've seen other forms of media like Prison Break, where everybody's that super tough guy, they get to prison and all they do is work out, or they try to get cigarettes delivered to them, they try to get other drugs smuggled to them, or they want like pornography magazines. But Andy just kind of wants to work at the library. He wants to help other people just enjoy themselves and just kind of work together. He enjoys classical music. There's that scene that I thought was pretty iconic where he locks himself in a room and gets everybody to just sit down and listen to music for a little while. And although that's not necessarily like stereotypically feminine, it just kind of contrasts with the typical brutal nature that people associate with prison. This guy seems really mild mannered. He just wants to listen to music and read. He doesn't really want to get incredibly buff or pick fights with people.
Coming to a conclusion, it's not that we look at Shawshank Prison and we think that this is entirely fiction, because as we're slowly finding out that prisons all around the world have a sort of problem, and even though a lot of people condemn the US to having poorly ran prison systems in comparison to a lot currently in this age, we're doing what seemingly seems a bit better than most. So, are there aspects of Shawshank Prison that are more ideal than real prison? Some would say that because Andy Dufresne is so legislatively inclined, because he has a background in accounting and probably politics and more well versed, he is able to better these prisoners' lives. Or are there aspects that are worse because this is a film that's set in the 1957s, and, or at least that's when Andy goes to jail, and within the first 15 minutes, a prisoner is just killed just for crying in the night. So, do you find that Shawshank Prison is on par with real prisons? Is it worse? Or is it somehow a little bit better?
I think for Andy, his experience is ideal because of his background and because he has something to offer the guards. Typically, if that's your case when you go to prison, I would imagine that if you have something to offer them, they will probably make your experience more tolerable. But I do think that it's probably on par with real experiences in prison, because I've obviously never been to prison. I'm not entirely sure what prison is truly like, but I imagined it's pretty terrifying, and people do probably break down when they go there because it becomes very real that this is going to follow you for the rest of your life, and it has the possibility of ruining your chances of ever living an ideal or normal life. So I think that it is probably on par with what people do experience in prison, but because it's a film, I have to think that it is somewhat idealized or somewhat better. I also have to take into account the fact that it's set in the late 40s and 50s and 60s, so the type of prison system that was being run then might be vastly different from the way that it's being run now. But regardless, since I've seen other documentaries that have kind of shown what prisons are like in, like Latin America or Russia, they seem substantially worse than what we have to offer. Although they're not necessarily like an ideal place to be. you know.
Awesome. Lastly, when it comes to personal insights, I for one believe that though the warden evolves into the sort of antagonist of the movie, as there really is no antagonist, as Andy Dufresne was just cheated by the justice system, I believe the main antagonist of the film is the concept of institutionalization. We see it in characters like Brooks, who has been in the prison system his entire life. And once he gets on the outside again, he finds that he cannot deal with the weight of living back in society and ends up killing himself. And we find towards the end of the film that when Andy's expressing his jailbreak and wants Red to come along with him, Red's only main concern is that he believes that he can't make it out of prison. He's become institutionalized and may be becoming around about the same as Brooks. And when he gets out, he even has these same ideas of finding ways to get back into. So, what is your sort of personal insight you took away from this movie?
Definitely the idea of institutionalization, where I found it very sad that a lot of the characters just resort to finding ways to go back into prison because it's all that they know. And I think that mirrors a very real problem that kind of plagues prisoners in modern days or in modern society, because a lot of them will just purposely go back to prison because it becomes a sort of home to them. I mean, you're there, you have a place to sleep, you get 3 meals a day, and they let you work or just do other things. So it gives you a sense of routine and a sense of purpose. And I thought that was a very interesting way to portray it and address a very real problem that does plague the prison system. And other than that, I was really fascinated by some of the symbolism that they include in the film, because I noticed that a lot of it was incredibly religious, and the warden himself is very religious and tries to instill Christianity upon a lot of his prisoners. So I found that kind of relatable growing up in a religious household and being sent to a lot of religious schools that also force theology upon you. And just certain scenes in the film, like when they're tarring the roof and Andy is able to get them all like beers and just give them a chance to act like regular men who just want to crack open a cold one on a like nice warm morning, so to speak. And that kind of mirrors the Last Supper and just the way that Red talks about him. He sees him as this sort of Christ figure because he's one of the only ones that is actually innocent who's in that prison. And when he breaks out of prison, it's almost as if he does it with no effort at all. He doesn't have to earn his salvation, whereas other characters like Red have to earn their salvation. And probably reading too far into it, that kind of makes me think that he's some sort of white savior, but I don't know. I feel like that's kind of reading a little bit too far into it. But just the religious aspects of it were very interesting. It gave me personally a lot to analyze in the film, and I thought it was very clever the way that they kind of set up some of the scenes to mirror different religious events.
Awesome.
So, just to begin off, I will start with a simple question. Do you like Shawshank Redemption, and where does it end up on your list of favorite movies?
Um, I mean, I definitely like it. I've only seen it maybe about 3 times. Um, and in my list of movies, maybe in the top 20, I would say,
Oh,
up
that's
there.
awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like the movie. Do you find that it was made in like 1993? Do you find that it still is relevant to modern day audiences?
It kind of depends on the audience, I guess. I kind of feel like there are definitely still parts of it that still fit the bill for a lot of modern society in terms of how we currently think about our um, justice and disciplinary system. But there's still aspects of it that are very like 18th century romanticized in a way.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
If someone were to think about watching it, what do you think that the film has to offer them in order to sort of incentivize that it's going to be a good movie?
Morgan Freeman.
Yeah,
um Definitely that wonderful human being. And I mean, probably just like the story of friendship would be the good first basis to get to for anyone who's like watching it for the first time.
yeah, definitely with like Andy Dufresne and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of Andy Dufresne, some sort of gloss over the fact because it's just dialogue. But Andy Dufresne spends the better part of 20 years of his life sentence in throughout the whole movie, but it doesn't feel like that because it's just 2.5 hours, and so you sort of think about it in that sort of time aspect. But what do you think that has to say about the temporal? What do you think the film has to say about the temporal rapidity of his sentence?
Um So I'm an anthropologist. We have a whole slew of theories about the space-time continuum and how anthropology and museums specifically kind of merges time and space all in one area. So you're looking at something that's like 5,000 years old, but you're in modern times. And you're trying to think about the use of that item in modern times. And that's kind of like the beauty of film, is that you can watch an old movie and still find those connections to contemporary like reality. And by seeing that compressed time, it's always very disorienting, but it helps you understand, like, sometimes it helps you understand the growth of a character, sometimes it's just, you know, especially for prison life in our contemporary understanding of it, for those of us who don't live inside that system, it's all very repetitive, same ideas, same things happening, all very routine. And so the fact that he goes through so many years in the length of the movie, it's just like, it makes you think that life in the prison might have been very mundane and monotonous, and just like the 20 years were really just nothing because it was all the same for him.
Yeah, definitely. He's a huge character in that one of the most iconic imagery within the movie is his jailbreak. And that sort of adds to the fantastical nature of the entire film that you get to witness that he goes against the justice system and provides his own form of justice when he thinks that he's innocent. But
Mhm.
despite all the fantastical nature of the film, do you think that this film was made to fearmonger audiences from going to prison? Because, in a similar sense, in contrast to fearmongering, there is a lot of prison camaraderie throughout the film. The instances where Red is able to get contraband from outside the prison and to the inside, and there's definitely the friendships that they all build with one another, especially within such a heinous area. Do you think that it was idea to fearmonger their audience, or even in a sense idolize the sort of prison complex?
I mean, I think it's in the same way that we idolize our friendships from high school and college. Because if you think about it, high school and college are very much like a prison sentence. Like, yeah, you either get to live at home, you live in a dorm, you live with your friends, whatever, but at the same time, you're still stuck in these four walls with your people, and you're there for many years. And it's just like, yeah, those people are your chosen family and you get to know them, but at the same time, you have no sense of freedom. You're still stuck in that regimented kind of system of life and living. And like, there's no way for you to really go out and experience reality in any way that you would if you were out of college, and like a real adult human being, as we call it now. So I definitely think it's supposed to like idolize and romanticize that kind of aspect of a forced yet formed community.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I agree with that heavily. There's a lot of stereotypes that come out of prison, but they still hold very true to the reality of what it means to uh, be a prisoner.
Hmm.
And in one of these instances, a negative instance, take Andy Dufresne, who for his first 2 years, in which it's only elaborated on in like under 5 minutes, that he experiences 2 years of his prison sentence being repeatedly raped and molested and abused by prisoners that are called the ladies, who, when Red talks about them, they aren't necessarily homosexual. He just says they're just simply prisoners that gets theirs, basically. Do you believe that in any form? Uh, uh, Sorry, I'm trying to say conforms to the sort of idea we have of prison, or in a different, or do you see it in a different way, in that it acknowledges that these men aren't homosexuals, and sometimes we'll have these, any new sort of media nowadays will sort of show them as like they are criminals, but they're homosexual, and so they enjoy having men. And some instances, like Sons of Anarchy, they're definitely characters who enjoy the company of men, but these are gentlemen that are simply getting theirs, as Red says.
Um, I think there's two aspects to that. I think the first part is really like thinking back to the Stanford prison experiment in the 1960s and the corruption of power in people. And in that experiment, which was horribly unethical and absolutely disastrous in the end, but like it was a week long. There were college students who were volunteers. Half of them were randomly selected to be prisoners, and the other half were randomly selected to be guards. And within that week, they created such corrupt chaos that the experiment had to end. And the experiment was supposed to go on for 2 months. So, like, in one aspect, there's definitely a corruption of power that happens within a prison system. And it doesn't have to be just like guard versus prisoner, but it could be clique related, just as cliques in reality kind of portray that same sense of dominance versus submissiveness. And there's that hierarchy of social status within that. And then on the other hand, you have the whole complex of homosexuality as it has been historically related and associated with poverty, with disease, with criminality, with anti-religiousness. And so, you know, with these men in prison, there's that status issue. And then there's that you're stuck in prison. There's only men in this prison because of the time period, and men and women are separated when it comes to our prison system. And everyone has needs. And it has been well documented throughout history, not only in nonfiction books, but also in fiction, that men will do what they need to do to access that kind of release that sexual intercourse provides. So, like in Beloved, they fuck a cow. That's great. They get their release. In prison, you have masturbation or you have raping another man, apparently. And, you know, that's horrific in some ways, especially because it's non-consensual and it's an assault and they're not respecting the other person. But it's also just like these people have options and there's a status symbol with that. And so you have all these other factors kind of piling on to that action and that behavior for those 2 years.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with a lot of the Stanford prison experiments, and very interesting. There was a whole documentary on it and everything,
Yeah.
and it seems very just awkward in the end.
It
But
just did not sound pleasant.
yeah, and it's incredibly interesting that you bring it up, because we're coming to a conclusion, and I was going to ask that Shawshank Prison is maximum security, obviously, but even in our own reality, do we hear, I saw an article just the other day that in a maximum security prison in Colorado, was there a death among just prisoners, and it was just one death of a prisoner, so at least they tackled the idea And that brings me to my question. Do you believe that there are aspects of Shawshank Prison that are ideal more so than our own reality, or are on par or even worse? Because a lot of corruption goes into it, especially for the time that it takes place, 1957, all the way to about 1977. And they rarely change at all. And you get to see the guards get away with many things, and the warden himself obviously get away with many things. But do you believe it's that experience holds true to reality? Maybe it's too fictionist.
Um, I mean, I definitely think it's a very concentrated form of our reality. So our own reality, we aren't confined to 200 or so people per like square block or whatever. Um, we have so many more people who live in like a neighborhood or a city, and that varies across the country. And if you were to stare at that society, it would take years to document that kind of behavior and that kind of action. And within a prison that is so isolated, that's so concentrated, and it almost moves in a different timeline than our own reality does. And so the fact of the reality is you have all of these actions going on in the prison in Shawshank Redemption and also in just our own reality that almost seem a little too unrealistic for our own like imaginations to really conceive of, but at the same time in our own world we have corrupt politicians, we have corrupt companies, we have corrupt leaders, and we have people who abuse that power and take advantage of that power, and people who don't have that power who use it to help themselves just get by. That happens to all of us. That's why we have a class system. That's why we have a 1% who has majority of our money. You know, it's very concentrated. And so I wouldn't say it's ideal. I think it's just compressed in a way that we can maybe see it better than we can see it reflected in ourselves.
Definitely. I only ask because the idea is that Andy Dufresne is more legislatively and sort of lawfully informed. And we find that he is able to make somehow, after 7 years, he attempts 7 years of trying to get a simple library. And some prisons, just for maximum security of all places, won't even have sort of a library in place. But you see that Andy Dufresne not only does that, but he re-educates or tries to re-educate the youth or one youthful individual that comes there to get a GED.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, in an aspect, is ideal in and of itself, that they get a second chance in relearning, at least. And even then, some would say that the idea that Brooks, one of the main characters, goes around, and though he hands out contraband, he has a book stand that he rolls through the prisons, and he gives everyone a book, regardless of what they want or don't want. So
Mm-hmm.
there is that aspect. But final question, do you have any insights that I wouldn't be aware of? For instance, my insight was when I was watching the film that though there was not solely an antagonist, there wasn't one from the beginning, as Andy Dufresne gets locked up, and you have this idea, well, the law sort of works in place as his antagonist, but you find that later that the built-up antagonist is the warden himself. However, I think that there is a bigger idea and a bigger fear in all of these men, and that exists in the character Brooks. It's first introduced the concept of institutionalization, and it comes up many times in the prison, in the film,
Mm-hmm.
that he can't live outside in society like a normal person anymore, and that he's thinking of all these ways in which he wants to get back into prison just to be there because he's been there for 60 or 70 years of his life. And then as soon as Red gets out, he has similar thoughts, a similar job, and in the same room in which Brooks killed himself. And so he's heavily thinking that he's not normal anymore. And Andy Dufresne, as he gets more and more punished, that's his biggest fear as well, which is sort of the jumping point in which he goes. And our very own Kimberly Gutierrez was able to provide me with an insight that I overlooked, that it's an incredibly religious movie because the warden is impressed with Andy Dufresne and how much of the Bible he knows. And more so than that, she made an observation that Andy Dufresne is sort of this white savior in that he never committed his crime, thus he never had to get salvation. However, in contrast, our character Red, has been trying for 40 years of his life, and you watch him attempt for like 20 years while Andy Dufresne is with him in prison to try and go back and get reinstitutional or deinstitutionalized. So, do you have any takeaways from the movie that I may have overlooked?
Yeah, so there's definitely many aspects that go into this. So the whole Christ figure and Christ comparison, that has been iterated many times over. That's a common analysis. Like, there are so many aspects of the movie that you can compare and contrast, of like Jesus' Last Supper, Christ versus Lucifer, and just all of the actions that happen. But also, within the idea of institutionalization, you have this wonderful comparison between Shawshank and the Tales of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, and a lot of other like stereotypical Southern literature, including Faulkner and Hawthorne. You have this idea of people who are born into this idea of freedom, to this cast of people who don't have any negative associations with them. And then you have these other people who are associated with criminal intent, negative behaviors, being seen as like savage or stupid, slavery, all of that. And with Huck Finn, you have Huck, who just wants to go on an adventure, and Jim is his ability to get that adventure. And he's the guide and conscience and the advice on that. And then with Shawshank, you have that same idea for Andy. It's almost like his adventure in life. It's unwarranted for sure, but it's still something that adds to his growth, and it doesn't affect him as a human being, because when people look at him, that's not what they assume. But for Red, especially, because they cast someone who is Black in that movie, and because of the way that they talk about institutionalization and the inability to escape that mindset, it's thinking about the contrast between these two people. One person who is like automatically guaranteed that innocence, and then one person who is automatically guaranteed guilt and all of these negative behaviors. All of the narcissism and evil of society is compounded in this one person, and they're stuck in that ideal, in that framework, and they can't get out of that. And so, for some people, they get stuck in that place and they can't leave, and they see no way out and they can't move forward. And then other people, they just, they're not associated in that negative way, and they can move forward. It's got that wonderful kind of dichotomy going.
Andy Dufresne sure does become untethered at the end. He starts off a lawyer, accountant, an accountant, my bad. And he certainly, towards the end, his idea of running away to Mexico, it's almost as if the 20 years didn't faze him at all, or anything that he encountered was just like, well, that was just it. And as for Red, it was sort of just like, well, I made a mistake, and now I've spent longer than you having to earn my freedom. And at least Red sort of earns his freedom, and he sort of is impatient in that it's like, I'm not waiting that long.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say that Red is more validated than Andy definitely is. Andy certainly does become the criminal at the end in the sort of law standpoint, in that he broke out of prison and could probably never be returned to America. And Red is guaranteed to be like a citizen once again.
Yeah, and not to mention, the contraband and illegally gained money as well.
Definitely. Well, Leah, thank you so much for helping me with this. I really do appreciate it. So many people called off on doing it, and I'm just like, oh man. And my teacher was also just like, everyone's hitting me up about these emails, and if you can't get anyone, just like make a documentary. So I'm glad
I know how it goes.
yeah, I definitely just appreciate that. I'm like, I set out so long ago to do the interviews, so I'm just like, I'm doing them. I'm finding some way. Thank you
Well,
so
I'm glad
much.
to be of assistance.